long before the pyramids of Giza dazzled the desert skyline, before the names of Khufu and Khafre became etched into the memory of civilizations. There was a king whose vision quietly reshaped the destiny of Egypt. His name was Djoser, a pharaoh now mostly forgotten in popular imagination. Yet he laid the first great stone upon which all of Egypt's monumental legacy would stand. It was under his reign that Egypt abandoned mud brick tombs and dared to raise the first pyramid in stone, a step pyramid that still rises from the sands of Saqqara like a weathered staircase to the heavens. Though his story lacks the glamour of later dynasties, Djoser's reign marked a turning point in history, and it all began with a vision that was more practical than divine, more enduring than extravagant. Djoser lived during Egypt's third dynasty, around the 27th century BCE. By this time, Egyptian civilization was already several hundred years old. Villages along the Nile had grown into bustling towns, agriculture thrived in the fertile floodplains, and the kings of the earlier dynasties had begun to assert their authority with more permanence. Yet in many ways, the Egypt of Djoser's time was still experimenting with statecraft. The rulers before him had been buried in Mastaba's flat, rectangular tombs of mud brick and stone. These were imposing in their own way, but they melted back into the earth over time. Nothing yet suggested that Egypt would one day raise the most durable stone monuments in the world. It was under Djoser's reign that a new idea took root, guided by his brilliant architect, Imhotep. This name Imhotep would echo faintly through history as one of the rare commoners deified after death. But in his lifetime, he was simply a man of knowledge and vision. He served as Djoser's vizier, physician, and designer. A mind that could see not only the needs of the present, but also the possibilities of the future. Together, Djoser and Imhotep began a project at Saqqara that would change how Egypt expressed power and eternity. Instead of a single mastaba, Imhotep proposed stacking one upon another, gradually rising upward in a series of steps. What began as a simple rectangular base became, through successive expansions, a towering six-tiered structure that reached nearly 200 feet into the sky. It was not smooth-sided like the later pyramids, but it was monumental in a way no building had been before. For the first time, Egypt had constructed not in mud brick, but in carefully cut limestone blocks. These blocks, each quarried, shaped, and set into place, were a declaration Egypt was no longer content with temporary forms. Its kings demanded permanence. The step pyramid of Djoser is often described as the first true pyramid, though in form it resembles a staircase more than the geometric perfection that would come later. Yet to the people of the third dynasty, it must have seemed otherworldly. Rising above the flat desert, gleaming white when new, it transformed the horizon. It was not just a tomb, but a symbol of divine authority, a place where the king could ascend to join the gods. Around it, an immense complex was built: temples, courtyards, shrines, and storerooms enclosed within a limestone wall. This was not just a resting place, but a statement of kingship itself, a miniature city for eternity. For Djoser, the pyramid was more than a burial project. It was a tool of legitimacy. Egypt was still consolidating its unity in these early dynasties, and the sheer scale of such a project would have sent a powerful message. To command the labor needed for such construction, quarrying thousands of tons of stone, transporting them across the desert, and arranging them into a coherent design was to demonstrate authority over both people and resources. For the farmers who toiled during the Nile's flood season, when fields lay submerged and idle, pyramid work became both a duty and a reminder of the king's reach. The monument was as much a political device as it was a spiritual one. Yet, despite the grandeur of his tomb, much about Djoser himself remains obscure. Unlike later pharaohs whose exploits were carved into walls or sung in hymns, Djoser left behind few personal records. He was remembered not for military conquest or sweeping reforms, but for his tomb, a silent but enduring testament. Even his name is debated. Some records suggest he may have originally been known as Net Jerikit, divine of body, with Djoser being a later title applied to him. In a sense, the man was overshadowed by his own monument. Life in Djoser's Egypt, however, can still be glimpsed through fragments of archaeology. The people who lived under his reign were part of a society growing in complexity. Villages along the Nile thrived on the annual flood, which provided fertile soil for wheat and barley. Farmers raised cattle, fished the river, and wove papyrus into mats and boats. Craftsmen worked in copper, stone, and faience, creating tools and ornaments. Religion centered around the gods of fertility, creation, and the sun, with the pharaoh serving as the earthly mediator between people and divinity. The rituals of kingship, enacted in stone within the Saqqara complex, were extensions of beliefs that touched every village and household. To imagine the step pyramid's construction is to picture thousands of workers under the desert sun, hauling blocks of limestone on sledges, using rams to move them upward, and cutting and polishing stone with copper tools. It was slow, grueling, repetitive work. But for the laborers, it was also participation in something larger than themselves. Each block laid was an offering to eternity, ensuring that their king would never be forgotten. Though their names are lost, their fingerprints remain pressed into the stones. A silent testimony that great monuments are not built by kings alone, but by countless hands. When Djoser eventually died, likely after a reign of nearly 2 decades, his body was interred within this step pyramid, deep inside a network of chambers and passageways. Buried with him were offerings, treasures, and rituals meant to sustain him in the afterlife. Yet the most enduring treasure was the pyramid itself, which stood above him, defying the centuries. Though looters would eventually strip away valuables and time would weather its stones, the structure remained, a beacon of Egypt's first monumental age. Looking back now, it is easy to overlook Djoser beside the giants of later dynasties. His name does not resonate like Ramses the Great or Tutankhamun. His pyramid does not inspire the same awe as the Great Pyramid of Giza. Yet without Djoser and Imhotep, there might never have been Giza. The step pyramid was the experiment, the first leap from earth to sky. In its steps, one can see the blueprint for all that followed: the smooth-sided pyramids, the colossal temples, and the enduring fascination with Egypt as the civilization of stone. And so, as you drift into the quiet of history's long night, Djoser stands at the threshold, a king not remembered for battles or wealth, but for daring to build differently. His pyramid still rises at Saqqara, weathered but steadfast, a staircase to the heavens carved in stone. Yet questions linger in the silence. Did Djoser himself imagine how long his monument would endure? Did he know that his architect's vision would outlast empires? Or was he, like all kings, simply seeking a way to be remembered, never knowing that in being the first, he had already secured eternity? When we step away from the towering presence of the step pyramid and look toward the lives of the people who lived during Djoser's reign, Egypt reveals itself as a society still finding its balance between tradition and innovation. The pyramid at Saqqara may have been extraordinary, but the daily lives of those who built it and worshipped under its shadow were marked by rhythm, routine, and the patient endurance of ordinary existence. It was within this cycle of planting, harvesting, worship, and labor that Djoser's Egypt truly took shape. Each year, the Nile River dictated the pattern of life. The annual inundation covered the floodplain with a layer of fertile silt, transforming it into a vast field ready to receive seed. Farmers, working with simple wooden plows drawn by oxen, sowed barley and emmer wheat, staples that sustained the kingdom. The timing of the flood, its height, and its retreat determined prosperity or hardship. Too little water meant drought and hunger. Too much meant destruction of homes and fields. The pharaoh's role was not only to ensure order in the kingdom, but to guarantee, through ritual and divine mediation, that the river would continue its life-giving cycle. In Djoser's reign, the rituals connected to the pharaoh took on a deeper meaning. Earlier kings had been rulers and were leaders, but by the third dynasty, The pharaoh was being reimagined as a divine figure in his own right, the living Horus on earth. Djoser's pyramid complex was not just a tomb, but a stage upon which this divine kingship was enacted. Within its walls lay chapels and courtyards that replicated in stone the ceremonies that legitimized his rule. The Hebs festival, a ritual of renewal meant to rejuvenate the king's power after decades on the throne, was symbolically represented here. Even though Djoser may not have lived long enough to celebrate such a festival in reality, the complex made sure that in eternity, the ritual was unending. The architecture of the Saqqara complex reveals how carefully these ideas were planned. The long colonnaded entrance hall, lined with stone columns carved to resemble bundled reeds, recall the temporary structures once built in wood and rushes. By recreating them in stone, Imhotep and his builders were translating Egypt's traditions into permanence. Every courtyard, every wall, every shrine echoed a ritual purpose. Some areas were built only for the spiritual essence of the king to move through in the afterlife, never meant for living human feet. To walk through the complex, as archaeologists do today, is to enter a symbolic landscape, a city of eternity where stone performed the duties of both palace and temple. Behind this monumental vision stood Imhotep, Djoser's vizier and master builder, though later centuries would elevate him to near mythical status, calling him the inventor of medicine, a sage of wisdom, and eventually deifying him as a god of healing. His life during Djoser's reign was grounded in practical genius. He must have overseen thousands of workers, balancing resources, schedules, and the logistics of quarrying and transporting limestone. Yet he was more than a manager. He was an innovator. It was Imhotep who first conceived of using stone as the primary building material. For such a vast project, the leap from mud brick to cut limestone was not simply technical, but ideological. It expressed permanence, eternity, and stability in a way no earlier tomb could. The reverence for Imhotep after his death suggests that he was remembered not only as an architect, but as a healer and priest. Centuries later, Egyptians would build temples in his honor, pray to him for cures, and inscribe offerings at his shrines. Few non-royal individuals in Egyptian history achieved such a legacy. Yet in Djoser's time, he was the quiet power behind the throne, the man who transformed his king's desire for eternity into stone reality. For the ordinary people of Egypt, however, life was less about eternity and more about survival. Most Egyptians lived in small mud brick houses with 1 or 2 rooms, their walls plastered with Nile mud that needed constant repair. Families slept on reed mats, cooked bread in clay ovens, and stored grain in jars sealed with mud. Children fetched water from the river, women ground grain into flour, and men labored in fields or workshops. Their connection to Djoser's pyramid was indirect but constant. Many were conscripted to work at Saqqara during the flood season, when farming paused. The work was repetitive and exhausting, dragging heavy stones on wooden sledges, mixing gypsum mortar, hauling rubble, or carving hieroglyphs under the direction of scribes. Yet this labor was framed as sacred duty. The king's tomb was not seen as the vanity of one man, but as the anchor of order for the entire land. By ensuring the king's eternal afterlife, the workers were ensuring the continued favor of the gods, which in turn meant the floods would come and the harvest would grow. The pyramid, then, was not only a royal project, but a collective investment in cosmic balance. Economically, Djoser's Egypt thrived on a centralized system. Taxes were collected not in coin, which did not exist yet, but in goods, grain, cattle, linen, or labor. These taxes fed into royal storehouses, from which food and supplies could be redistributed. This surplus allowed for large building projects, military campaigns, and support for priests and officials. At Saqqara, storerooms built of stone lined the pyramid complex, designed to hold offerings and supplies for eternity. These were echoes of the real economy, mirrored in the afterlife to ensure nothing would be lacking. Religion, too, permeated every layer of society. The gods were not distant abstractions but present forces. Ra, the sun god, traveled daily across the sky, his light both warming and judging. Osiris, lord of the underworld, offered hope of life after death. Horus, the falcon god, embodied kingship itself, while Djoser, as pharaoh, was his living representative. Each offering placed in an altar, each prayer whispered before a shrine, reinforced the idea that human order and divine order were bound together. In this sense, the step pyramid was less a tomb than a colossal prayer in stone, one that spoke not only for Djoser, but for the entire kingdom. And yet, even as Djoser's pyramid soared, his reign was marked by the same vulnerabilities that haunted all of Egypt. The Nile's floods remained unpredictable, diseases spread quietly through villages, and political tensions always lurked beneath the surface. Archaeological evidence suggests that famines may have struck during his reign, remembered in later inscriptions that credit Djoser with restoring abundance through ritual devotion. Whether or not these stories are literal, they reflect how deeply people believed the pharaoh's role was tied to survival. When the river failed, it was the king's duty to restore balance through sacrifice and prayer. As we consider Djoser's Egypt, the image that emerges is one of contrast. On one side, a society capable of unprecedented ambition, raising stone monuments that would outlast millennia. On the other, ordinary lives defined by toil, hunger, and fleeting joys. The pyramid united these worlds. For Djoser, it was a guarantee of eternal kingship. For his people, it was a fragile hope that by honoring their ruler, they were also securing their own place in the great cycle of order and renewal. When night fell over Saqqara, the pyramid loomed silently against the stars, its steps reflecting the faint glow of moonlight. Villagers in the distance lit their small fires, cooked their bread, and told stories under the sky. To them, the structure may have seemed both alien and divine, a staircase for their king to climb into the heavens. And perhaps they wondered, as we might still wonder, could a building truly hold eternity? Or was it only stone, destined like all things to crumble in time? When Djoser's reign finally drew to a close, Egypt stood transformed. The king who had inherited a kingdom of mud brick and modest tombs left behind a vision in stone that reshaped the future of pharaohs. His death, like that of all kings, was not an end but a transition. For his people, the rituals that prepared his body for eternity were as important as the victories of his reign. The embalmers would have wrapped his body in linen, anointed it with oils, and placed it in a series of nested coffins. Deep beneath the step pyramid lay a labyrinth of chambers and corridors, cut into the bedrock, where his sarcophagus awaited. These underground passages stretched for more than 5 kilometers, an astonishing maze that mirrored both palace and underworld. Walls of blue glazed tiles lined certain rooms, imitating the reed mats of a royal residence. Even in death, Djoser would walk the corridors of kingship, ruling in a palace of eternity. Offerings were stored in stone-built magazines within the complex. Jars of beer, baskets of grain, cuts of meat, fine linens. These were not symbolic alone, they were essential provisions for the afterlife, ensuring that Djoser's Ka, his life force, would never hunger or thirst. Priests assigned to his mortuary cult performed daily rituals in his honor, lighting incense, chanting hymns, and placing fresh food before his statues. For generations, Djoser remained a presence in Egyptian religion. His name invoked its ceremonies long after his burial, yet while his pyramid stood firm, the man himself slowly faded into the background of Egypt's collective memory. His successors, inspired by his monument, pushed the idea of pyramids further. Snefru, a later king of the 4th dynasty, experimented with different forms, building not 1, but 3 pyramids, including the smooth-sided red pyramid, the true forerunner of the Great Pyramid. At Giza, his son, Khufu, took the vision to its extreme, raising the colossal Great Pyramid, a wonder that dwarfed Djoser's creation in both size and fame. In this way, Djoser became both a pioneer and a shadow. Without him, there would have been no Khufu, no Giza plateau lined with monumental tombs. But because others built even larger and more spectacular pyramids. His own step pyramid was relegated to the status of a prototype in the eyes of later generations, where Khufu's name echoed across the world as one of the seven wonders. Djoser's remain locked within scholarly circles. Imhotep's legacy, however, traveled a different path. Centuries after Djoser's death, Imhotep was remembered not just as an architect, but as a sage of wisdom and healing. In the New Kingdom, scribes copied wisdom texts attributed to him. By the late period, temples were built in his honor, and Egyptians prayed to him for cures. In Ptolemaic times, he was identified with the Greek god Asclepius, the healer. While most pharaohs vanished into anonymity, Imhotep, once a mere commoner, achieved immortality in memory as a god. It is a rare irony of history. The servant outlived the king. The step pyramid itself had a long and boring afterlife that was anything but simple. Over millennia, wind and sand eroded its surface, stones collapsed, and earthquakes left it cracked and broken. Yet it never vanished completely. Travelers in antiquity still marveled at its strange step form. When the Greeks and Romans came to Egypt, they saw it as a curiosity of the distant past. Medieval Arab chroniclers described it in their writings, often with awe, sometimes with confusion. By then, the name of Djoser was forgotten, but the stone mountain still stood, silent against the desert. In modern times, the step pyramid became an object of study and restoration. Archaeologists uncovered its subterranean chambers, its blue-tiled rooms, and its ceremonial courtyards. They found statues of Djoser, the most famous of which now sits in the Egyptian Museum, his calm face gazing across the centuries. Conservation efforts in recent decades have stabilized the pyramid, ensuring it will endure into the future. Even now, as tourists walk its paths, they participate in the same act of remembrance that priests once performed, keeping Djoser alive in memory. And yet, for all his achievements, Djoser remains strangely forgotten outside Egyptology. Ask a passerby in America to name an Egyptian pharaoh, and they will likely mention Tutankhamun, whose golden mask dazzled the modern world, or Ramses the Great, whose monuments proclaim his glory. Some may recall Cleopatra, queen of intrigue and legend. But Djoser, his name rarely passes their lips. His greatness lies quietly at the foundation of Egypt's monumental age, invisible to those who only know the most famous chapters. Perhaps that is fitting. Djoser's pyramid was not built to be a spectacle for foreign tourists, but to serve a purpose within the eternal rhythm of Egyptian belief. His people did not seek fame in distant lands. They sought order, balance, and the assurance that their king would rule forever in the afterlife. In this sense, Djoser's true legacy is not in how often his name is spoken today, but in how his vision reshaped the destiny of Egypt itself. Without him, the age of pyramids might never have risen. So when the desert winds sweep over Saqqara and the last rays of the sun turn the step pyramid golden, one might imagine Djoser's Ka still walking its courtyards, his presence lingering in the stone, forgotten by many, remembered by few. He remains a quiet giant of history, of pharaoh whose first step lifted Egypt onto the path of eternity. Most people, when they think of the pyramids of Egypt, imagine the Great Pyramid of Giza, Khufu's monument, towering, flawless, and famous enough to be counted among the seven wonders of the ancient world. But long before Khufu claimed his eternal mountain of stone, there was his father, Sneferu, the true pioneer of pyramid building. Strangely, despite being the king who built not one, not two, but three massive pyramids, Sneferu's name has slipped into the shadows of history. Few outside the circles of scholars even recognize him. And yet, without Sneferu, the age of pyramids might never have reached its peak. His reign represents an era of experimentation, of bold architectural ambition, and of costly mistakes that shaped the very identity of ancient Egypt. When Sneferu came to the throne around 2613 BC, he inherited more than a kingdom. He inherited a problem. His predecessor, Huni, had left Egypt with political stability, but the question of royal burial was still unsettled. The kings of the third dynasty, like Djoser, had experimented with step pyramids and grand tomb complexes, but no one had yet built a smooth-sided pyramid. The iconic form we now associate with Egypt, Snefru's reign, beginning the fourth dynasty, would change that forever. The man himself remains something of a mystery. His parentage is debated, though he may have been the son of Huni by his secondary wife, which could explain why his claim to the throne required careful consolidation. His queen, Edifir's Eye, was of royal blood, and their son, Khufu, would later eclipse them both. Ancient records describe Snefru as a benevolent ruler, a king who was approachable and kind. Though this might be later idealization, what is clearer is that Snefru commanded immense resources, armies of workers, quarries of stone, and the wealth of a unified Egypt. With this power, he embarked on building projects that dwarfed anything that had come before. His first great project was at Meidum, a site just south of modern Cairo. There, construction began on what was originally intended as a step pyramid, probably begun by Huni and completed by Snefru. But Snefru was not satisfied with the traditional step form. He wanted something grander, something new. The builders encased the steps in smooth limestone, transforming the structure into a true pyramid. Yet disaster struck, at some point perhaps during construction, or perhaps soon after the outer casing and even much of the underlying structure collapsed. What remains today is a strange tower-like course surrounded by a massive heap of rubble, giving the impression of a ruin rather than a triumph. For modern visitors, the Meidum Pyramid appears broken, a failed experiment. But for historians, it tells an important story. The attempt to transform a step pyramid into a smooth-sided one revealed the engineering challenges involved, the angles, the foundation. The casing all had to be recalculated. Snefru's architects learned hard lessons at Meidum, lessons that would inform their future designs. It is easy to see the collapsed ruin as a failure, but in the larger picture, it was a necessary step in the evolution of pyramid building. Meanwhile, Snefru was not only a builder. His reign saw military campaigns into Nubia to the south and Libya to the west, securing Egypt's borders and bringing in wealth and resources. Expeditions into the Sinai Peninsula supplied copper and turquoise, essential for tools and ornaments. Records from ancient scribes describe fleets of ships returning with cedar wood from Lebanon, prized for its strength and aroma. These resources fueled his building projects, allowing Snefru to mobilize tens of thousands of laborers and artisans. Life for the common workers was harsh, but it also brought employment, rations, and a sense of participation in a monumental national project. In this sense, Snefru's reign was not only about pyramids. It was about reshaping Egypt as society into one that revolved around the power and image of the pharaoh. The scale of Snefru's building is almost incomprehensible. Archaeologists estimate that he moved more stone during his reign than almost any other pharaoh, even Khufu. Each pyramid required quarries, transport, and logistics on a grand scale. Workers cut limestone, blocks from cliffs, dragged them on sledges to the Nile, floated them on barges, and hauled them across ramps to the construction site. The work was grueling, but it created a sense of rhythm in Egypt's economy, a system that would last for centuries. Snefru's projects were as much about training and organization as they were about monuments. By the time Khufu began his own pyramid at Giza, the workforce and methods were already perfected. Still, at this stage in Snefru's reign, the Meidum Pyramid was an open wound. It did not fulfill his vision of a perfect eternal tomb for a king whose afterlife depended on the permanence of his burial place. This was no small matter, so he turned his attention to a new site, Dashur, a stretch of desert a short distance north of Meidum. Here, Snefru began what would become the Bent Pyramid, another audacious attempt to master stone. But before we reach the curious angle of the Bent Pyramid, it is worth pausing to consider why Snefru was so determined. The Egyptians believed that the pyramid represented a stairway to the heavens, a physical manifestation of the sun's rays upon which the king could ascend to the afterlife. A failed pyramid was not simply a construction error, it was a failure of cosmic order. For Sneferu, this was personal, religious, and political all at once. His determination to keep building, despite setbacks, reflects not stubbornness alone, but a deeper need to prove himself as a king chosen by the gods. Thus, by the middle of his reign, Sneferu stood at a crossroads. He had wealth, power, and resources. He had already reshaped Egypt's economy and extended its reach beyond its borders. But his eternal house, his monument to the ages, was still incomplete. The rubble at Medum whispered of failure, and only another attempt could silence it. In the windswept desert at Dashur, the foundations of the next great pyramid began to rise. Would this second attempt finally achieve the smooth side of perfection he desired, or would it, too, carry the scars of human error? When workers at Dashur laid the first stones of Sneferu's second pyramid, they must have felt the weight of history pressing down upon them. The Medum pyramid stood behind them as a cautionary tale, its collapsed sides warning of failure. Yet Sneferu pressed forward, determined to create something that would not only endure, but also redefine what a royal tomb could be. What rose from the desert at Dashur would later be called the Bent Pyramid, a monument both impressive and strangely imperfect, a structure that captures in stone the trial and error spirit of Sneferu's reign. The Bent Pyramid began ambitiously. Its builders started with steep sides rising at an angle of about 54 degrees, much sharper than what later pyramids would adopt. For a time, the monument soared smoothly upward, its limestone casing gleaming white in the desert sun. It was intended to be the first true pyramid, with clean, straight edges that converged into a point. Unlike Djoser's step design or Medum's trouble transformation, yet as the structure grew taller, engineers began to notice troubling signs. Cracks appeared in the inner chambers, stresses shifted in the masonry, and the base threatened to give under the immense weight. Somewhere around the halfway point, the decision was made. The angle had to be changed. Instead of continuing the steep rise, the builders abruptly shifted to a gentler slope of about 43 degrees. The result is visible even today, a pyramid that rises sharply and then relaxes, as if bending its shoulders under the load of stone. This compromise saved the structure from collapse, but it also created an oddity: the only pyramid in Egypt that bends visibly in mid-construction. To modernize, the Bent Pyramid looks like a mistake frozen in time. But for historians, it is a monument of adaptation. It shows that Sneferu's architects were not blindly repeating formulas. They were learning, experimenting, and adjusting. They chose preservation over perfection, and in doing so, they ensured the pyramid would survive. Indeed, the Bent Pyramid still stands today, one of the best preserved of all Egyptian pyramids, its original smooth casing largely intact. For those who approach Dashur, its gleaming sides provide a rare glimpse of what pyramids looked like in antiquity, before centuries of looting and erosion stripped them bare. The internal chambers of the Bent Pyramid are equally unusual. Unlike later pyramids, it contains the separate entrance passages, one descending from the north face and another from the west. Each leads to different chambers, both corbel vaulted with layers of stone stacked inward to form high, sloping ceilings. These architectural features reveal the builders' attempts to distribute the weight and prevent collapse. It was an experiment in stress management, a careful balance between ambition and stability. But the Bent Pyramid was not just a technical experiment. It was also a deeply symbolic project. At Dashur, Sneferu established an entire pyramid complex, complete with temples, causeways, and subsidiary structures. Rituals tied the pyramid to the sun god Ra and to the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. For Sneferu, this pyramid was not simply a tomb. It was a declaration of kingship, a monument aligning him with cosmic order, even if its shape bent awkwardly. Its meaning remained intact. Life around Dashur during construction must have been vibrant, if exhausting. Thousands of workers camped nearby, organized into teams that cut blocks, hauled sledges, and assembled ramps. Overseers recorded deliveries of bread, beer, and onions, the rations that fueled the workforce. Skilled masons shaped limestone, while carpenters built sledges and ramps. The hum of activity filled the desert, a city of laborers devoted to a single monumental goal. It was more than construction. It was a statement of Egypt's collective will, marshaled under the command of the pharaoh. For Snefru himself, however, the bent pyramid may have carried a sting of disappointment. It stood complete, stable, and functional as a tomb, but its bend marked it as imperfect, a compromise. In the logic of Egyptian kingship, where monuments were meant to reflect divine perfection, this imperfection may have been intolerable. And so, astonishingly, Snefru ordered yet another pyramid, a third attempt to achieve the eternal form. Why did he not simply accept the bent pyramid as his final resting place? The answer lies partly in religion and partly in ambition. The pyramid was not just for burial. It was a cosmic engine, ensuring the pharaoh's soul could ascend to the heavens. An imperfect form might have raised doubts about its efficacy. Moreover, Snefru's reign had already become defined by building. To leave behind only a flawed monument would have been unworthy of his vision. Thus, even as ceremonies continued at the bent pyramid, workers were dispatched to lay foundations for yet another colossal project. Just a short distance away on the same plateau, the decision was unprecedented. No king before Snefru had attempted such scale, such repetition, such insistence on perfection. The bent pyramid, remarkable in its own right, became a stepping stone towards something greater, the Red Pyramid, Egypt's first true pyramid in form and execution. By the end of his work at the bent pyramid, Snefru had already reshaped Egyptian architecture and engineering. He had mobilized vast resources, tested bold designs, and learned from failures without surrendering to them. His reign was one of relentless experimentation, of pushing boundaries until the dream of a perfect pyramid became reality. And yet, standing before the bent pyramid, one cannot help but wonder, did Snefru see it as a flawed failure, or as a noble monument of adaptation? Was it, in his eyes, a mistake, or a testament to persistence? When construction began on Snefru's third pyramid at Dashur, the lessons of Medum and the bent pyramid hung heavy in the air. Two attempts had already consumed staggering resources, tens of thousands of workers, years of labor, and millions of limestone blocks. Yet Snefru was not finished. For him, immortality required perfection, and the bent pyramid's bent shoulders could not stand as his eternal symbol. Thus rose the Red Pyramid, so named for the reddish limestone that still glows in the desert sun. It would be Egypt's first successful true pyramid and Snefru's crowning achievement. Unlike the steep angles that doomed earlier projects, the Red Pyramid was built at a safer, shallower slope of 43 degrees from the start. This cautious design reflected the hard lessons learned. At the bent pyramid, where stress and instability had forced a mid-course correction, the Red Pyramid rose steadily and surely, its base spreading wider, its weight distributed more evenly. When it was completed, the monument stood about 105 meters tall, a giant in its own right, second only to the later Great Pyramid of Khufu. Walking into the Red Pyramid even today is like stepping back into Snefru's ambition. The entrance passage slopes downward deep into the heart of the structure, leading to three corbelled chambers with soaring, slanted ceilings. The craftsmanship reveals confidence, stones fitted tightly, angles calculated with precision. Spaces designed for eternity. There are no abrupt bends here, no cracked foundations, only calm, balanced order. If the bent pyramid was compromise, the Red Pyramid was resolution. The sheer scale of Snefru's project still astonishes. Archaeologists estimate that across his three pyramids, Medum, Bent, and Red, Snefru's builders moved more stone than Khufu did for the Great Pyramid. The workforce required to quarry, transport, and assemble these blocks may have numbered in the tens of thousands, organized into a sophisticated system of crews and overseers. Rations of bread, beer, garlic, and onions sustained the laborers, while copper tools, stone hammers, and wooden sledges shaped and dragged the massive blocks. These pyramids were not just monuments. They were engines of the state, mobilizing Egypt's wealth, resources, and people toward a single vision. For Snefru himself, the Red Pyramid was more than just stone. It was a solution to his anxieties about eternity. At last, he had a monument that fulfilled both religious and architectural requirements. Its smooth sides mirrored the rays of the sun, forming a perfect path for his soul to ascend to the heavens. Its massive bulk proclaimed his power, not as a flawed experiment, but as a definitive statement of kingship. It was, in every sense, the culmination of his reign. Yet history has a way of obscuring pioneers. Today, few outside the world of Egyptology remember. Snefru. Ask the average person about pyramids, and they will name Khufu, whose Great Pyramid at Giza became the wonder of the ancient world, or perhaps Ramses the Great, builder of temples and statues. Snefru's name rarely surfaces. His pyramids, while monumental, were overshadowed by what came after his son Khufu built higher, stronger, and more famous. Later pharaohs like Ramses claimed more glory. Snefru, despite his unmatched contributions, slipped quietly into obscurity. Still, his legacy endures in subtle ways. Without Snefru's experiments, Khufu could never have built his wonder at Giza. Without Medum's collapse, there would be no lessons in stability. Without the bent pyramid's awkward compromise, there would be no understanding of proper slope. Without the Red Pyramid, there would be no prototype for the true pyramids that defined Egypt's golden age in this sense. Snefru was the silent architect of Egypt's most iconic symbols, the man whose ambition carved the path for others. The afterlife of Snefru's pyramids tells another quiet story. The Medum Pyramid became a ruin, yet it still fascinated ancient travelers. The bent pyramid, with its unusual form, was revered in later periods, possibly even associated with dual aspects of the sun. The Red Pyramid remained intact, its reddish glow earning it both admiration and mystery. Over millennia, their stones were sometimes stripped for other projects, yet their cores remained. Testaments to Snefru's persistence. In the modern era, archaeologists uncovered their secrets, crawling through chambers and passages, piecing together the story of a king who would not give up until he had reshaped eternity itself. Perhaps the greatest irony is that Snefru's determination, his refusal to settle for imperfection, ensured he would always be slightly hidden behind his son. Khufu's Great Pyramid was only possible because Snefru built the road to it. Yet Khufu's monument eclipsed his father's in fame. Snefru's work was foundational, invisible. Like the bedrock beneath the stone, he remains the pharaoh most Americans do not know, yet one without whom Egypt's monuments would not exist. In the quiet desert of Dashur, when the sun sets behind the Red Pyramid and its stones turn golden red, one can still sense Snefru's vision. He was not simply a king building tombs. He was a dreamer testing the limits of stone, a ruler unwilling to leave his eternity to chance. His pyramids may not dominate postcards or coffee table books, but they remain standing, solid and unbroken, carrying his legacy across 4,500 years. Snefru may be forgotten by name, but every time someone looks at the Great Pyramid of Giza and marvels at its perfection, they are unknowingly honoring the king who made it possible. His story reminds us that history often forgets the builders, even when their work shapes the world. The desert wind carries whispers of names that once shook the earth, and among them lies one almost lost to time, Sahir. Few today have heard of him, yet his reign in Egypt, as Fifth Dynasty, marked a turning point that shaped the empire's future. While pharaohs like Khufu and Ramses became synonymous with pyramids and colossal statues, Sahir's legacy is quieter, yet no less profound. He was a master of trade, diplomacy, and naval innovation, the ruler who opened Egypt's horizons beyond its own borders. His forgotten story reveals how Egypt shifted from building the biggest monuments to building the strongest connections. Sahir ascended the throne around 2487 BCE, inheriting an Egypt that had already tasted the glory of the Pyramid Age. The Great Pyramid stood tall on the Giza Plateau, a wonder visible for miles. But such monumental building had drained resources and strained the kingdom's people. Sahir was no less ambitious than his predecessors, yet he understood that raw size was not the only measure of greatness. Instead of pouring everything into colossal stone mountains, he directed Egypt's wealth into trade routes, fleets, and cultural connections. In many ways, his reign signaled a shift from inward grandeur to outward expansion. His most visible monument is the pyramid complex at Abusir, located between Giza and Saqqara. At first glance, his pyramid may seem modest compared to Sneferu's Red Pyramid or Khufu's masterpiece, rising only about 47 meters. It lacks the overwhelming presence of earlier pyramids, yet the surrounding mortuary, temple decorated with intricate reliefs, is what makes Sahir's project remarkable. Within its walls, carved scenes come alive with vivid detail, ships brimming with exotic goods, royal processions, foreign captives, and depictions of Sahir himself receiving tribute. Unlike the more austere monuments of earlier kings, Sahir's temple was a celebration of connections, an archive of Egypt's new horizons. These reliefs provide the earliest and clearest evidence of organized naval expeditions in Egyptian history. Ships are shown with sails unfurled, crews at work, and holds filled with treasures from distant lands. This was not symbolic art alone, it was historical record. Sahir had dispatched fleets across the Red Sea to the legendary land of Punt, a mysterious region likely located along the coast of modern Eritrea, Somalia, or southern Arabia. From Punt came incense, ebony, animal skins, and exotic animals' luxuries essential for both religion and prestige. Incense, in particular, was prized for temple rituals, its fragrant smoke believed to carry prayers to the gods. Sahir's success in securing these imports transformed Egyptian ritual life, giving the priesthood a steady supply of sacred offerings. Trade under Sahir extended north as well. Records indicate contact with Byblos, a thriving city on the Lebanese coast, famous for its cedar wood. Egyptian temples and boats relied heavily on this timber, which Egypt itself lacked. Byblos also acted as a gateway for goods flowing from the wider Near East. The reliefs show Phoenician ships arriving with precious woods, resins, and possibly even metals. By securing these connections, Sahir ensured that Egypt would remain not just a land of stone, but a participant in the vibrant network of early Bronze Age commerce. Naval power was central to this achievement. Sahir's fleets were not ad hoc ventures but carefully organized expeditions. Reliefs show long boats with multiple oarsmen, sails for catching the wind, and raised sterns and prows for stability at sea. These were innovations that hinted at Egypt's growing maritime confidence. While earlier kings may have dabbled in seafaring, Sahir institutionalized it, making Egypt a seafaring power. His reign marks the birth of Egypt's navy not as a tool of conquest, but as a bridge of trade. Yet Sahir was not only a trader, he was also a warrior when necessary. The reliefs in his temple depict him smiting Libyan tribes, bringing back captives and cattle. These images followed traditional royal iconography, but they also reflected real threats along Egypt's western frontiers. By balancing warfare with diplomacy, Sahir secured Egypt's borders while expanding its influence abroad. His reign thus combined the old model of king as warrior with a new model of king as merchant. Religion, too, took on new dimensions under Sahir. He was the first king to build extensively for the sun god Ra at Heliopolis, beginning a tradition that would dominate the 5th dynasty. This shift reflected the growing importance of solar theology and Egyptian religion. The pyramids themselves, with their sloping sides, symbolized the sun's rays. Now, direct worship of the sun god gained prominence. Sahir's investment in temples and rituals tied his reign not just to earthly prosperity, but also to cosmic order. Despite these innovations, Sahir's memory faded faster than those of the great pyramid builders. His pyramid at Abusir deteriorated more quickly than earlier constructions, partly because of inferior stone quality and perhaps because resources had been diverted to other projects. Later kings built nearby, overshadowing his monument. Over centuries, the desert sand swallowed much of his legacy, leaving behind ruins and fragments. To the casual eye, Sahir seemed unremarkable compared to giants like Khufu. But the details tell another story. He was the first Egyptian ruler to truly make seafaring a state enterprise. He was the first to weave Egypt into a web of international trade with consistency. He was the first to give the sun god Ra architectural priority in the capital's religious life. His reign was not about size, but about direction. In many ways, Sahir set Egypt on a new course, less obsessed with singular, massive monuments and more invested in sustainability, diplomacy, and networks. When modern archaeologists uncovered the reliefs of Sahir's temple, they realized they had stumbled upon the birth of Egypt's navy and its golden age of trade. These carvings remain one of the most vivid sources for understanding the world of Old Kingdom Egypt. They remind us that greatness is not always measured in sheer height of stone, but in the reach of influence. Sahir's ships may not have been as tall as Khufu's pyramid, but they carried Egypt's name across seas, securing goods, allies, and prestige. Sahir is the forgotten pharaoh, who showed Egypt that power could flow not only from armies and monuments, but from trade winds and sails. When you think of Egypt's pharaohs, images of colossal pyramids and monumental statues usually come to mind. But with Sahir, the true grandeur lies not in the height of his pyramid, but in the intricate details of his reign. His story unfolds less like a tale of stone and more like a tapestry woven with trade winds, sea routes, and cultural exchanges. If Section 1 introduced Sahir as the ruler who pointed Egypt toward the sea, Section 2 takes you deeper into the mechanics of how his maritime ventures worked, how they reshaped Egypt's economy, and how his policies quietly prepared Egypt for centuries of prosperity. The pyramid complex at Abusir still serves as our primary window into Sahir's achievements. Carved into the limestone walls of his mortuary temple are dozens of scenes showing his fleets, expeditions, and rituals. These are not decorative flourishes. They are records of state policy. Imagine walking through those temple corridors thousands of years ago, lit by flickering oil lamps, the scent of incense heavy in the air. On one wall, ships sail toward the Red Sea, crews working in unison. On another, foreign envoys present gifts to the pharaoh. Each carving was a carefully chosen message, broadcasting what Sahir wanted future generations to know about his rule. That Egypt was no longer a kingdom of isolation, but one connected to distant shores. His most famous expedition was to the land of Punt. Later pharaohs like Hatshepsut would also send voyages there. But Sahir's reliefs are the earliest and most vivid depictions of this mysterious place. Punt was a source of luxury goods that Egypt could not produce itself: myrrh, frankincense, ebony, ivory, and even live animals like baboons and panthers. These items were not trivial luxuries. They held deep cultural and religious value. Incense was essential for temple rituals, as it was burned daily before statues of the gods. Myrrh oil was used in embalming and purification, granting it a sacred role in Egyptian funerary practices. Exotic animals symbolize Egypt's global reach and the pharaoh's ability to control distant lands. The reliefs show long ships with high prows and sterns, each large enough to carry dozens of sailors. Scholars believe these ships could reach up to 30 meters in length, impressive for their time. They were equipped with both sails and oars, allowing them to navigate the unpredictable waters of the Red Sea. Organizing such a fleet required a complex system: carpenters to construct the ships, farmers and fishermen to provide supplies, scribes to keep records of cargo, and soldiers to guard the expeditions. What Sahir established was not just a voyage, but a logistical machine, a state-run enterprise that blended engineering, administration, and ambition. The wealth that flowed from Punt and other trading partners transformed Egypt's economy. Before Sahir, Egypt's prosperity had been largely land-based, rooted in the fertility of the Nile and the monumental building projects that mobilized its population. With Sahir, a new dimension was added. Maritime trade is a consistent source of wealth. This allowed Egypt to diversify its economy and reduce the risks of relying solely on agriculture. If the Nile failed to flood in a given year, trade could soften the blow. If building projects consumed too many resources, imported goods could replenish supplies. In a sense, Sahir's policies were an early experiment in globalization. His expeditions were not limited to Punt. Reliefs and inscriptions indicate contacts with Byblos in modern-day Lebanon. The cedars of Byblos were Egypt's lifeline for timber. Without strong wood, ships and monumental doorways could not be built. Sahir's connection with Byblos likely involved reciprocal gifts: Egyptian gold, papyrus, and grain exchanged for cedar logs, resins, and wine. It was through Byblos that Egypt tapped into the wider networks of the Eastern Mediterranean, connecting indirectly with cultures as far away as Mesopotamia. Trade also flowed southward along the Nile into Nubia. Expeditions to Nubia under Sahir brought back gold, copper, animal skins, and slaves. The gold of Nubia would later become one of Egypt's most prized resources, funding its temples and wars. But under Sahir, these expeditions were not yet militarized conquests. They were more exploratory and commercial. The emphasis was on wealth acquisition through exchange rather than domination. Though depictions of Sahir smiting enemies remind us that force was always an option if diplomacy failed, religious developments during Sahir's reign further highlight his forward-thinking approach. He was the first pharaoh to dedicate significant resources to the cult of Ra, the sun god. At Heliopolis, earlier kings had linked their pyramids symbolically to solar worship, but Sahir institutionalized it with dedicated temples. This reflected a broader cultural shift, the growing prominence of solar theology, which would dominate the 5th dynasty. By elevating Ra, Sahir tied his reign to the life-giving sun, a symbol of renewal and eternal order. The trade goods he imported: incense for burning, exotic animals for ritual displays fit neatly into this framework, making commerce not only practical but sacred. Another overlooked detail is Sahir's role in developing Egypt's navy as a permanent institution. Earlier kings may have built boats for specific purposes, but Sahir appears to have created an organized fleet, maintained for both war and trade. This distinction matters. A temporary expedition leaves little long-term impact, but a permanent naval force reshapes the kingdom's structure, requiring shipyards, training grounds, and bureaucratic oversight. In this way, Sahir was as much an administrator as a conqueror. He built systems, not just monuments. And yet, despite these achievements, Sahir's pyramid complex tells us something sobering about the fragility of legacy. His pyramid, though still standing, is in worse condition than many older ones. Built from local limestone of lower quality, it crumbled more quickly under the pressures of time. This decline in construction quality has puzzled historians. Was it because Egypt's focus had shifted from building to trade and religion? Or was it a deliberate choice, redirecting resources away from monumental sites and toward broader economic and religious projects? Whatever the reason, the result was that later generations walked past his ruins and remembered the larger pyramids. Instead, Sahir's innovations were buried in sand and overshadowed by stone. It is a reminder of how easily priorities shape memory. A pharaoh who builds the tallest pyramid becomes immortal in the eyes of tourists and textbooks. A pharaoh who builds ships and temples may leave behind only fragments, even if his influence on daily life was far greater. Sahir's reign forces us to reconsider what greatness truly means. Is it measured in visible monuments, or in invisible systems that sustain a civilization? As the centuries passed, Sahir's name faded. Later kings built their own sun temples, expanded their own fleets, and reaped the benefits of trade routes he had opened. They took his innovations for granted, embedding them into Egypt's political and religious DNA. Meanwhile, his pyramid eroded and his reliefs broke apart. By the time of Herodotus, writing nearly 2,000 years later, Sahir's name was already forgotten. And yet, every Egyptian fleet that sailed, every temple that burned incense to Ra, and every cedar log hauled from Byblos carried echoes of his reign. Section 2 of Sahir's story shows a man who redefined Egypt's priorities. He was not a builder of single monuments, but a builder of networks. He taught Egypt that survival and prosperity depended not just on the Nile as flood, but on the winds of the Red Sea and the currents of the Mediterranean. He left behind not a towering pyramid, but an enduring idea. That power can be extended through connection, not just construction. And that raises a haunting question. If Sahir had not opened the seas, not trained a navy, not forged ties with Punt and Byblos, would Egypt have remained a landlocked kingdom powerful on land, but blind to the world beyond the desert horizon? By the end of his reign, Sahir had transformed Egypt in ways that went far beyond stone and mortar. While his pyramid at Abusir may have been modest compared to the towering monuments of Khufu or Sneferu, it reflected a new philosophy of rulership, one that valued sustainable influence, maritime strength, and religious devotion over sheer size. Sahir's innovations, though less visible, would ripple through generations, quietly reshaping the kingdom's priorities. Sahir's final years saw a consolidation of his naval power. The fleets he had commissioned were no longer experimental. They were established institutions. His successors inherited not just boats, but a framework for ongoing trade and defense. Ships could now sail reliably to Punt, bringing back incense, ebony, and exotic animals year after year. Byblos remained a consistent source of cedar wood, vital for both construction and shipbuilding. Even Nubia, to the south, became a region of structured tribute rather than sporadic conquest. In essence, Sahir had created a durable system for Egypt's prosperity, one that extended the kingdom's influence far beyond its natural borders. Religious developments under Sahir also matured. His devotion to the sun god Ra helped cement solar theology as a central component of Egyptian religion. The temples he built and the rituals he established elevated Ra to a primary deity, setting a precedent that lasted well into the later 5th dynasty and beyond. The incense and exotic goods he imported were not mere luxuries. They were critical to maintaining the sanctity of these rituals, linking Egypt's expanding trade network directly to its religious life. Through these initiatives, Sahir demonstrated that a king could unify spiritual and economic power, subtly reinforcing his authority while fostering a sense of cultural cohesion. Politically, Sahir strengthened Egypt's borders and centralized power. While he did engage in military action, particularly against Libyan tribes in the west, his reign emphasized diplomacy and economic expansion over conquest. Foreign emissaries appear in temple reliefs, bringing gifts and acknowledging Sahir's influence. These depictions were more than propaganda. They represented real-world alliances that secured Egypt's place in the broader Near Eastern world. By blending military might with trade diplomacy, Sahir created a model for sustainable rulership, ensuring that Egypt could maintain influence without exhausting its resources. Yet for all his accomplishments, Sahir's memory faded more quickly than that of other pharaohs. The Abusir pyramid complex deteriorated faster than earlier pyramids, partly due to its construction from lower quality limestone, and partly because the Egyptian focus had shifted toward trade, religion, and smaller-scale building projects. Subsequent kings built in Giza, Saqqara, and Dashur, leaving Sahir's monuments in relative obscurity. To the casual observer, he was overshadowed by those who built taller, stronger, or more visually imposing structures. His achievements, though foundational, were subtle and easily overlooked by history. Modern archaeology has restored some of Sahir's legacy. The reliefs of his mortuary temple, painstakingly uncovered from centuries of rubble, reveal the extent of his maritime and trade accomplishments. They are a testament to a pharaoh whose genius lay not in size, but in vision. Without Sahir, Egypt's navy would have been delayed, its trade routes undeveloped, and the kingdom less connected to the wider world. His work provided the infrastructure for centuries of Egyptian prosperity, allowing later pharaohs to build on a foundation that was already robust, well managed. and internationally aware. Sahir's story also offers a lesson in the fragility of fame. History often remembers kings who are visually spectacular, those who leave behind monuments that dominate landscapes and imagination. But those who innovate quietly, who establish systems, networks, and practices that endure over time, can be forgotten, even when their influence is immense. Sahir's fleet sailed silently. His trade routes thrived unseen, and his temples facilitated worship for decades. Yet his name became nearly invisible outside specialized scholarship still. For those who look carefully, traces of his impact are everywhere. Every Egyptian ship that sailed beyond the Nile, every temple ritual performed with imported incense, every cedars and gold transaction with Byblos all carried Sahir's fingerprints. He had turned Egypt into a connected kingdom, one capable of projecting power and influence far beyond its borders. And in doing so, he reshaped the very notion of kingship. It was no longer enough to build tall monuments. One had to build networks, institutions, and enduring systems. The quiet grandeur of Sahir's reign contrasts sharply with the more dramatic reigns of pyramid builders or warrior pharaohs. His monuments may be smaller, his name less remembered, but his strategy and foresight echo through Egyptian history. When later kings expanded trade, built fleets, or emphasized raw worship, they were following a path first cleared by this almost forgotten ruler. In a sense, Sahir built Egypt not just with stone, but with vision and organization, a ruler whose genius was systemic rather than ostentatious. As we walk among the ruins of Abusir today, one can almost hear the hum of his fleets, feel the energy of his bustling temples, and sense the careful orchestration of a ruler whose ambition extended beyond mere monuments. Sahir's life invites reflection on how history remembers its leaders. Sometimes the tallest pyramid is celebrated, while the architect of sustainable systems fades into obscurity. Yet the world we know, built on networks, trade, and administration, owes much to rulers like Sahir, quiet visionaries who shape civilizations from behind the scenes. Ultimately, Sahir teaches a profound lesson. Influence is not always visible. True power may lie in foresight, in the creation of systems that outlast the fame of kings. His pyramids may crumble, and his name may fade, but the structures he built within Egypt's economy, religion, and diplomacy endure, forming the invisible skeleton on which future generations relied. In this way, Sahir is far from forgotten. He is woven into the very fabric of Egypt's enduring legacy. Few pharaohs have been as quietly transformative as Nefertari. Unlike the legendary Khufu or the ambitious Neferu, Nefertari's name rarely appears in mainstream history books. Yet his reign during Egypt's Fifth Dynasty marks a turning point in the administration of the kingdom, a period where monumental building continued, but the machinery of state became more efficient and structured. To the casual observer, his pyramid at Abusir may seem modest, but it represents a subtle revolution in how Egypt managed its resources, its people, and its monuments. Nefertari ascended the throne around 2475 BCE, inheriting the innovations of his predecessors, especially Sahir, whose naval expeditions and international trade routes had expanded Egypt's horizons. The kingdom was stable, wealthy, and culturally vibrant. The major challenge for Nefertari was not conquest or exploration, but organization, how to sustain monumental construction, religious devotion, and an expanding bureaucracy without exhausting the state. His approach was methodical, almost administrative in its genius, emphasizing efficiency and continuity over flashy displays. His pyramid complex at Abusir reflects this philosophy. While smaller and less celebrated than the pyramids of Giza, it introduced structural refinements that would influence subsequent builders. The core was built using local limestone, but the layout of the mortuary temple, causeways, and subsidiary structures displayed remarkable standardization. This approach minimized waste and sped up construction without compromising religious or ceremonial function. Archaeologists have noted that Nefertari's pyramid appears as a blueprint for future kings, showing how to balance ambition with pragmatism. Neferkare also standardized record-keeping for construction projects and resources. Papyrus fragments from the period indicate detailed accounts of laborers, rations, and stone deliveries. These records reveal a level of bureaucratic sophistication previously unseen. By creating consistent systems for project management, Neferkare ensured that Egypt could undertake large-scale construction without mismanagement or excessive strain on its population. This may seem like a minor detail, but for a civilization built on monumental stone, efficient administration was critical to sustainability. Beyond the pyramid, Neferkare continued the religious reforms begun under Sahir. He invested in solar cult temples, particularly for Ra, expanding upon the networks that integrated worship with state administration. These temples were not merely spiritual centers, they also served as hubs of economic activity, distributing resources, coordinating labor, and collecting tribute. By linking religion and bureaucracy, Neferkare strengthened the pharaoh's influence over both the material and spiritual lives of his subjects. Trade, though less emphasized than under Sahir, continued to play a role in Neferkare's reign. Reliefs and inscriptions suggest ongoing expeditions to Byblos for cedar wood, and to punt for exotic goods. Ships and crews were likely maintained as permanent assets, supporting both commerce and diplomacy. By stabilizing these networks, Neferkare ensured that Egypt's economic engine ran smoothly, allowing resources to be allocated effectively for building, ritual, and governance. His reign was not without challenges. Evidence indicates that pyramid construction sometimes faced labor shortages or material delays, yet Neferkare's organizational reforms mitigated these problems. He created hierarchies of supervisors, maintained detailed schedules, and developed standardized procedures for quarrying, transporting, and assembling stone, where previous kings relied more on sheer manpower and improvisation. Neferkare relied on structure and foresight politically. Neferkare maintained Egypt's stability through careful governance rather than conquest. There are no records of major military campaigns during his reign, suggesting that he focused inward, ensuring that the kingdom's administration, economy, and religious institutions were functioning efficiently. This stability allowed future kings to undertake grander projects without overburdening the population. Despite these achievements, Neferkare's name, like Sahir's, faded over time. Later pharaohs built larger pyramids, overshadowing his modest structures. The efficiency he introduced became so normalized that future generations may have overlooked the innovation it represented. Yet without his administrative reforms, Egypt might not have sustained the scale of monumental building and state management required by subsequent kings. Neferkare's legacy is subtle but profound. He streamlined the machinery of state, balancing ambition with order, innovation with practicality. His reign shows that greatness is not only in towering stone, but also in the invisible frameworks that allow civilizations to endure. Without leaders like Neferkare, Egypt's monumental achievements could have crumbled under mismanagement or logistical failure. As we examine the ruins of his pyramid and mortuary temple, we glimpse a pharaoh who quietly ensured the survival and efficiency of one of history's greatest civilizations. This story reminds us that sometimes the most significant impact comes not from spectacle, but from careful planning and foresight, shaping a civilization in ways that are felt more than they are seen. Even though Neferkare is almost entirely forgotten by popular history, his methods paved the way for the stability and grandeur of later dynasties, proving that the real foundation of Egyptian greatness was not only in its stone monuments, but also in its systems, organization, and enduring institutions. While previous kings had relied primarily on monumental displays of power, Neferkare understood that true influence rested on efficient administration, a lesson that would define Egypt's longevity. Construction during Neferkare's reign was a model of precision. Workers were organized into hierarchically arranged crews, each assigned specific tasks. Quarry teams focused solely on extracting limestone, while transport squads moved the blocks to the pyramid site using sledges and manpower. Skilled masons shaped stones with copper chisels, carefully measuring and aligning each block. Supervisors recorded progress in detailed papyri, noting quantities of stone moved, rations distributed, and labor hours logged. This meticulous record-keeping ensured accountability and minimized delays, a stark contrast to earlier pyramids, where trial and error often slowed construction. The pyramid itself, though modest compared to Giza, introduced innovations that improved stability and efficiency. Its core utilized layered limestone blocks of standardized size, making assembly faster and more predictable. Surrounding the main pyramid, the mortuary temple was compact yet functional, designed to serve religious ceremonies without excessive labor or resource expenditure. Causeways connecting the pyramid to nearby temples were constructed with careful attention to logistics, allowing priests, officials, and laborers to move easily between structures. These choices reflected Neferker's philosophy, function, and durability over grandeur. For its own sake, religious life under Neferker was deeply intertwined with governance. By strengthening the cult of Ra and integrating temple networks with state administration, he ensured that religious institutions were both spiritually and economically productive. Temples became centers for resource distribution, labor coordination, and wealth accumulation. Priests not only performed sacred rituals but also managed food storage, construction labor, and trade goods. This symbiosis of religion and bureaucracy reinforced the pharaoh's authority, embedding his influence into the rhythms of daily Egyptian life. Trade, though more subdued than under Sahir, remained essential. Expeditions to Byblos for cedar would continue, supporting both construction and naval needs. Ships were maintained as state assets, allowing for controlled importation of essential materials. Trade also provided Egypt with exotic goods such as resins, oils, and semi-precious stones, which were used in religious ceremonies, luxury items for the elite, and offerings to the gods. By keeping trade steady and predictable, Neferker reduced the risk of shortages that could disrupt construction or ritual activity, demonstrating foresight and administrative skill. Neferker also demonstrated skill in human resource management. Labor was not merely conscripted. It was organized in a way that balanced efficiency with sustainability. Workers received regular rations of bread, beer, and vegetables, ensuring they were fed and able to maintain productivity. Supervisors rotated crews to avoid fatigue, and specialized craftsmen were employed for tasks that require precision. By managing manpower thoughtfully, Neferker minimized the social strain that had burdened earlier large-scale projects, creating a model that later pharaohs could replicate. Politically, Neferker maintained stability through administration rather than warfare. There are no records of large-scale military campaigns during his reign, suggesting that his focus was inward. By keeping Egypt's bureaucracy efficient and its economy robust, he reinforced the pharaoh's authority without relying on force. This approach fostered a more sustainable model of governance, one where the king's power depended on organized systems rather than intimidation or monumental displays alone. Neferker's efficiency extended to taxation and resource management. Temple estates, mining operations, and agricultural lands were meticulously recorded, ensuring that tribute flowed smoothly to the crown. This allowed the state to fund construction projects, religious ceremonies, and trade ventures without overburdening the population. It also created a framework for accountability that reduced corruption and mismanagement, contributing to long-term stability. Despite these advancements, Neferker's reign remained visually modest. His pyramid, smaller than the great monuments of his predecessors, did not inspire awe in the same way. Later kings would overshadow him with larger projects, but those kings relied on the very systems Neferker had put in place. Without his reforms, massive constructions like the pyramids of later dynasties could have faltered under logistical or economic strain. In this sense, Neferker's true monument was invisible, a network of processes, institutions, and organized labor that enabled Egypt to sustain greatness. Neferker's reforms also laid the groundwork for cultural continuity by linking trade, temple administration, and construction oversight. He ensured that Egypt's religious and economic life could persist even during times of transition. His emphasis on efficient record-keeping and standardized procedures meant that knowledge was preserved, allowing future scribes, priests, and officials to maintain consistent practices. This continuity was crucial in an empire that spanned millennia, helping to stabilize Egypt even as dynasties rose and fell. By the end of his reign, Neferker had quietly transformed the machinery of Egypt. He had shown that kingship could rely on structure and foresight as much as on monuments and warfare. While his name may have faded from popular memory, the systems he established ensured that Egypt's later rulers could achieve grandeur without repeating the costly inefficiencies of the past. And yet, a question lingers. How many other leaders in history, like Neferker, have quietly built the foundations of greatness without ever being remembered for their ingenuity? How often does history reward spectacle over substance, leaving the true architects of civilizations largely invisible? By the close of Neferker's reign, Egypt had entered a period of administrative sophistication unseen in previous dynasties. His pyramided Abusir may have lacked the height and drama of Gizeh's monuments, but it embodied a quiet, enduring power. A king who understood that the longevity of his empire depended not only on stone and spectacle, but on organization, foresight, and the careful management of resources. In this sense, Neferker's true legacy is invisible yet omnipresent. Like the foundations upon which great civilizations are built, Neferker's mortuary temple and surrounding structures serve as subtle testaments to his innovative approach. The temple walls, adorned with reliefs and inscriptions, record both religious rituals and practical matters, lists of offerings, detailed inventories of food and goods, and instructions for priests and administrators. These records reveal a pharaoh who viewed religion and statecraft as inseparable. By ensuring that temples functioned as economic and administrative hubs, Neferker created systems that could maintain both spiritual life and bureaucratic efficiency. The temples were, in effect, multifunctional institutions, securing Egypt's cultural continuity while supporting the pharaohs' governance. His influence extended far beyond the confines of Abusir. The standardized construction techniques he introduced, uniform limestone blocks, organized labor crews, and detailed progress records streamlined pyramid building across the kingdom. Later kings benefited from these innovations, completing monuments more efficiently and with fewer mistakes. While Neferker may not have erected the tallest pyramid, he taught Egypt how to build sustainably, turning lessons learned from past failures into procedures that ensured future success. Trade and naval expeditions, though less celebrated than during Sahir's reign, continued under Neferker. The networks he helped maintain routes to Punt for incense and exotic goods, Byblos for cedar wood, and southern Nubia for gold and cattle remained vital. By institutionalizing these connections, Neferker ensured that Egypt's economic and cultural life was resilient. Goods, ideas, and religious artifacts flowed steadily into the kingdom, reinforcing both the pharaoh's prestige and the prosperity of the state. Neferker's reign also highlights the subtle balance between visibility and impact. While his predecessors built monuments to awe and intimidate, Neferker focused on the machinery that made greatness sustainable. His achievements were structural rather than spectacular, administrative rather than dramatic. This focus may explain why history has largely overlooked him. Unlike Khufu or Sneferu, whose towering pyramids dominate the imagination, Neferker's contributions were invisible to casual observers, embedded in systems rather than monuments. Yet the impact of these systems is profound. Without his reforms, subsequent pharaohs might have struggled to manage labor, resources, and religious institutions efficiently. Egypt's monumental building projects, trade networks, and bureaucratic stability relied on the frameworks Neferker put in place. In this sense, His legacy is foundational, forming the invisible scaffolding upon which Egypt's golden age rested. Even the decline of his pyramid did not erase his influence. Though Abusir's structures eroded faster than those at Giza or Dashur, the organizational and administrative innovations they embody persisted. Temple economies continued, records guided labor, and future construction projects followed the standards he established. Neferker's impact endured not through grandeur, but through the persistent function of the systems he created. His story also serves as a reflection on historical memory. Leaders who achieve greatness through spectacle are celebrated and remembered, while those whose genius lies in planning and administration often fade into obscurity. Neferker exemplifies this paradox. While his pyramid may not dominate postcards, his methods enabled Egypt's continued success. He teaches us that true influence is not always obvious, and that the foundations of civilization often lie hidden in routine, record keeping, and foresight. In the quiet remains of Abusir, one can almost sense Neferker's presence. The carefully aligned blocks, the inscriptions detailing offerings and resources, and the layout of temples all speak to a ruler deeply committed to order, efficiency, and the well-being of his kingdom. His reign reminds us that history is shaped not only by spectacle but by the systems and structures that sustain it. Ultimately, Neferker's lasting lesson is this: civilizations endure not merely because of monuments, armies, or fleeting displays of wealth, but because of thoughtful planning, consistent administration, and careful management of resources. In creating these invisible frameworks, Neferker ensured that Egypt could achieve greatness long after his name had faded from memory. The next time we marvel at the pyramids or consider the reach of the Egyptian empire, we are seeing the results of a king whose genius lay in structure, foresight, and the quiet power of efficient governance. History may have forgotten Neferker, but the empire he helped sustain owes him a debt that no monument, however grand, could ever fully capture. His story reminds us that sometimes the most important legacies are those we cannot see, yet feel in every stone, every temple, and every enduring institution that outlasts the fame of kings. Some rulers are remembered for centuries, while others vanish almost entirely, leaving behind only whispers of their existence. Pharaoh Neferfer, also known as Ra-Nefer-F, is one such figure, ascending the throne of Egypt's 5th dynasty as a young man. He ruled for only a few years, around 2460 BCE. His reign was brief, yet it offers a glimpse into the fragile nature of power, the demands of kingship, and the ways in which early Egyptian rulers navigated the challenges of governance. Despite his short tenure, the traces of Neferfer's role reveal both ambition and vulnerability, making his story a poignant chapter in the history of ancient Egypt. Neferfer inherited the throne after the reign of Neferker, his father, at a time when Egypt was politically stable and economically prosperous. The administrative systems established by Neferker, record-keeping, labor organization, and temple management provided a solid foundation for the young pharaoh. Yet for Neferfer, assuming the crown at such a young age meant navigating not only state affairs but also the expectations of the royal court, powerful officials, and a population accustomed to the strong hand of adult rulers. His youth brought both energy and uncertainty, a combination that would define his short reign. One of the most remarkable aspects of Neferfer's rule was his ambitious building projects. Despite his limited time on the throne, he began constructing a pyramid at Abusir, following the tradition of his predecessors. Though unfinished at his death, the pyramid and surrounding mortuary temple reflect the careful planning and ritual importance that characterized even a brief reign. Archaeologists have found fragments of inscriptions and reliefs indicating that Neferfer intended to continue Egypt's dedication to the sun god Ra, integrating religious devotion with the display of royal authority. His unfinished pyramid stands as a silent testament to a reign cut short, a monument to potential rather than achievement. Despite the brevity of his rule, Neferfer's administration continued the policies of his father. Temple economies remained active, trade expeditions persisted, and the bureaucratic machinery of Egypt functioned smoothly. This continuity suggests that the young pharaoh had advisors and officials who guided him in governance, helping to maintain stability, even in an era of centralized power. The ability of a minor ruler to rely on an established system highlights the foresight of earlier pharaohs and the resilience of Egypt's institutions. The brevity of Neferfer's reign makes it difficult to fully assess his impact. Unlike longer-reigning pharaohs, he did not have the time to expand trade networks, launch naval expeditions, or leave an enduring mark on monumental architecture. Yet the fragments of his plans indicate a king who intended to uphold Egypt's traditions while potentially introducing his own innovations. In this sense, Neferfer represents what could have been an Egyptian history, a ruler whose promise was evident but whose time was too short to realize it. Religious life during Neferfer's reign remained central. The young pharaoh continued the worship of Ra, commissioning offerings and ceremonies that would honor the sun god and reinforce his legitimacy. Reliefs from his mortuary temple depict priests preparing ritual items, including incense and food, while scribes recorded the proceedings. These details suggest that even in a reign lasting only a few years, Neferfer maintained the spiritual rhythms that bound Egyptian society together. Religion, in this case, provided continuity and stability, linking the short-lived reign to the enduring traditions of the dynasty. Historical records of Neferfer are sparse, yet they reveal glimpses of familial dynamics and succession planning. After his unexpected death, the throne passed to his brother, Nyasir-Ini, ensuring continuity of the fifth dynasty. This succession highlights the precariousness of power in ancient Egypt. Life expectancy, illness, and unforeseen events could abruptly end a reign, shifting the course of history. Neferfer's story reminds us that kingship was not solely about ambition or skill. It was also deeply contingent on health, timing, and circumstance. Archaeological findings in Abusir provide some insights into his intended projects. Relief fragments show depictions of royal ceremonies, offerings to gods, and even references to the young king himself. These traces, though incomplete, suggest a ruler eager to leave his mark on both the spiritual and material world. They also reveal how Egypt's bureaucratic and religious systems were resilient enough to continue functioning even when a ruler's reign ended prematurely. Neferfer's brief rule illustrates a fundamental truth about history. Not all rulers leave enduring monuments or celebrated achievements, yet their existence shapes the narratives of those who follow. His unfinished pyramid, temple fragments, and sparse records serve as reminders of the fragility of life and the transience of power. While longer-reigning pharaohs dominate textbooks and popular imagination, kings like Neferfer underscore the importance of context, preparation, and the unseen mechanisms that sustain a civilization even in moments of uncertainty. As we consider Neferfer's reign, one cannot help but wonder, how might Egypt have evolved if he had lived longer? Would he have expanded trade, commissioned new temples, or innovated further in administration? Or would his rule have simply continued the incremental stability established by his predecessors? The answers remain lost in time, leaving only fragments for modern scholars to piece together a tantalizing puzzle that sparks both curiosity and reflection. Section 1 introduced Neferfer as a young pharaoh whose reign, though brief, hinted at ambition and potential. Section 2 explores the intricacies of his administration, the challenges he faced as a youthful ruler, and the ways in which his short tenure left subtle but enduring marks on Egypt's political and religious landscape. Ascending the throne at a young age presented Neferfer with both opportunities and vulnerabilities. While his advisors ensured continuity of governance, the king himself needed to assert authority to maintain legitimacy. Egypt's bureaucracy, established by previous pharaohs like Neferkare, was sophisticated but required careful oversight. Officials managed temple economies, supervised labor for construction projects, and coordinated the flow of goods from trade networks. Neferfer relied on this system, but he also faced the constant challenge of demonstrating personal leadership and a court full of experienced advisors, generals, and priests. Construction projects continued during his reign, though his unfinished pyramid at Abusir indicates both ambition and the limitations of his short time on the throne. Laborers worked on the pyramid core, mortuary temple, and subsidiary structures, while scribes maintained detailed records of workers, rations, and resources. This meticulous approach ensured efficiency. Yet the abrupt end of Neferfer's reign left some projects incomplete. The pyramid, intended to serve as a monument to his authority and a focal point for religious devotion, remains a poignant symbol of potential unrealized. Religion was central to Neferfer's governance. He upheld the worship of Ra, reinforcing the connection between kingship and divine authority. Temples functioned not only as spiritual centers, but also as hubs for economic activity and administration. Priests managed the collection of offerings, organized ceremonial activities, and oversaw temple estates that contributed to the kingdom's wealth. Even in a short reign, Neferfer maintained these systems, ensuring that the rhythm of daily religious life continued without disruption. Trade, though less expansive than under Sahir or Neferkare, remained stable during Neferfer's rule. Egypt's maritime and overland networks continued to supply goods critical for both ritual and royal consumption. Expeditions to Byblos brought cedar wood, while southern trade routes provided gold, cattle, and other resources. Maintaining these networks required coordination between officials, merchants, and sailors, a testament to the resilience of the infrastructure established by previous kings. Even a youthful pharaoh like Neferfer could rely on these well-functioning systems to uphold the kingdom's prosperity. The young pharaoh's brief reign also underscores the precariousness of life and power in ancient Egypt. Records suggest that Neferfer may have succumbed to illness or unforeseen circumstances, cutting short initiatives that could have shaped Egypt's trajectory. His death illustrates how dynastic stability often depended not just on administration or military strength but on the health and longevity of individual rulers. The seamless succession of his brother Niaser Ini ensured continuity, but it also highlights that Neferfer's vision remained incomplete, a kingdom sustained, yet a king's ambitions unfulfilled. Despite the brevity of his rule, fragments of reliefs and inscriptions reveal a ruler attentive to both ceremonial and practical matters. Scenes depicting offerings, ritual processions, and royal appearances suggest an understanding of the symbolic importance of kingship. At the same time, records of labor distribution and resource management indicate a pragmatic approach to governance. Even a short-lived reign could exert influence if structured effectively, demonstrating that Neferfer's administration, though temporary, left an imprint on Egypt's bureaucratic memory. The incomplete pyramid and mortuary temple serve as physical reminders of this fleeting power. Archaeologists studying Abusir note that while the structures are unfinished, they reflect careful planning and adherence to architectural norms established by his predecessors. The pyramid's layout, intended for both ritual and funerary purposes, demonstrates continuity in religious practice and state-sponsored construction. These remnants allow modern scholars to piece together Neferfer's priorities and approach to kingship, offering insight into a ruler who otherwise remains largely invisible in historical texts. Neferfer's story also illustrates a broader theme in Egyptian history: the tension between personal ambition and systemic continuity. Even a youthful pharaoh with grand plans could rely on established institutions to maintain stability. Conversely, his abrupt death reminds us that the individual behind the crown could significantly alter history, or in this case, leave history with tantalizing fragments and unanswered questions. His reign was a bridge between the accomplishments of his father Neferkare and the longer, more celebrated rule of Niaser Ini, ensuring that progress, however incomplete, continued without interruption. And reflecting on Neferfer's short tenure, one is struck by both the fragility and resilience of Egyptian kingship. A ruler could be removed suddenly by circumstances beyond control, yet the systems, structures, and traditions he inherited or slightly altered could sustain the kingdom for generations. Neferfer's reign, brief as it was, underscores how Egypt's enduring strength relied as much on its institutions as on individual brilliance or longevity. And yet, an unsettling thought lingers. How much of history is shaped by potential unrealized? How many rulers like Neferfer quietly set the stage for success, only to vanish before their vision could take full effect? His unfinished pyramid, fragmentary inscriptions, and sparse records serve as reminders that the story of a civilization is often written as much by what is lost as by what endures. Neferfer's reign, though brief, leaves a profound impression precisely because it was so fleeting. The unfinished pyramid at Abusir, fragments of mortuary temple reliefs, and sparse inscriptions stand as mute witnesses to a king whose ambition outpaced his years. While history often remembers pharaohs who ruled long, built vast monuments, or waged conquests, Neferfer's story is a reminder that influence is not always measured in duration or scale, but in the subtle marks left on the continuity of a civilization. The young king's unfinished pyramid is more than a mere construction project. It embodies the tension between potential and reality. Archaeological studies reveal that the core structure followed the conventional layout of the 5th Dynasty pyramids, with subsidiary temples and causeways arranged to support both ritual and administrative functions. Even in his short reign, Neferfer ensured that the design incorporated both symbolic and practical considerations, reflecting a ruler aware of his responsibilities despite his youth. The pyramid, incomplete though it may be, serves as a lasting testament to the careful planning that characterized his administration. Religion remained a central pillar during Neferfer's rule. Offerings, ritual ceremonies, and temple management continued without interruption, indicating that the young pharaoh understood the inseparable link between spiritual authority and political legitimacy. Reliefs show priests performing daily rituals, scribes documenting offerings, and officials overseeing temple estates. These activities highlight the resilience of Egypt's religious and bureaucratic systems, which functioned effectively even under the guidance of a ruler who ruled only briefly. Neferfer's ability to maintain this continuity ensured that the kingdom did not falter. During a potentially destabilizing period, trade networks, too, remained active, supplying the kingdom with resources essential for both daily life and ceremonial purposes. Byblos continued to provide cedar, punts and exotic goods, and Nubia contributed gold and livestock. The seamless operation of these trade systems demonstrates that Neferfer's administration, although temporary, relied on well-established practices that supported the broader economy. His reign illustrates how the machinery of the state could sustain itself, even in the hands of a youthful and inexperienced ruler. Despite the brevity of his rule, Neferfer's death triggered careful succession planning. His brother, Niaser-Ini, ascended the throne, ensuring the continuation of projects, religious ceremonies, and trade operations. This smooth transition underscores a central aspect of Egyptian kingship: the resilience of institutions over the individual ruler. Even when a king's potential is unrealized, the structures established by predecessors and maintained by the bureaucracy enable the civilization to endure and thrive. Yet, Neferfer's story also emphasizes the fragility of human ambition. His vision for Egypt, whether in monumental construction, trade expansion, or religious devotion, was cut short by circumstances beyond his control. In this sense, his reign is emblematic of the countless leaders whose influence is only glimpsed in fragments, whose potential shapes history in indirect ways. The young pharaoh reminds us that history is not only written by those who complete their projects, but also by those who set wheels in motion, leaving a legacy carried forward by others. The unfinished pyramid and temple fragments at Abusir now serve as historical mirrors, reflecting both the ambition and vulnerability of a young king. Archaeologists examining the site can trace his intended projects, but much remains incomplete, inviting reflection on the nature of leadership and mortality. Neferfer's reign prompts a deeper question: how many rulers' achievements have been lost to time? not through failure, but through the brevity of their lives. Even in obscurity, Neferfer's subtle influence persisted. The administrative frameworks, religious observances, and construction practices he upheld allowed his successor to build upon a stable foundation. The continuity of Egypt's bureaucracy, trade, and ritual life owes as much to these brief reigns as to the longer, more celebrated ones. In this way, Neferfer's impact was quiet but crucial, ensuring that Egypt's civilization remained unbroken and resilient despite the unpredictability of life and succession. Ultimately, Neferfer teaches a lesson about the delicate balance between potential and realization. His reign may not have been marked by grandeur or conquest, but it underscores how even fleeting leadership can shape the course of history. Civilizations endure not only through the accomplishments of their most famous rulers, but also through the careful maintenance of systems and traditions during moments of transition. Neferfer's brief life reminds us that the unseen work of governance, continuity, and stewardship often holds as much power as monuments or victories. In reflecting on Neferfer's story, one is left with a sense of both melancholy and admiration. He ruled too briefly to fully implement his vision, yet his stewardship ensured that Egypt's machinery of state continued to function, allowing his successors to thrive. His life, though largely forgotten, forms a critical thread in the tapestry of Egyptian history, demonstrating that even the shortest reign can leave lasting impressions if it sustains the rhythm of civilization. The legacy of Neferfer invites contemplation. How do we measure the impact of a ruler? Is it in stone and spectacle, or in the quiet preservation of a civilization's stability? In his brief tenure, Neferfer reminds us that history often favors those who endure, but even those who flicker briefly can illuminate the path for generations to come. In the annals of Egyptian history, few pharaohs are as enigmatic as Shepsesker. Unlike Khufu or Ramses II, whose reigns are well documented through monuments, inscriptions, and historical records, Shepsesker left behind almost no trace. Historians know very little about him, and what evidence exists raises more questions than answers. His reign, which occurred during Egypt's 5th dynasty, may have lasted only a few months, or perhaps a couple of years, but even in this fleeting period, the story of Shepsesker reveals the fragile, sometimes chaotic nature of kingship in ancient Egypt. Shepsesker ascended the throne under circumstances that remain obscure. Some scholars speculate that he was a rival claimant, possibly a brother or distant relative of the previous king, and that his brief reign reflected political instability or internal disputes within the royal family. Unlike the methodical administration of Neferkare or the organized projects of Neferfer, Shepsesker's rule appears ephemeral. There are no completed monuments, no inscriptions celebrating trade expeditions, and almost no records of his policies. His disappearance from history has led to his nickname among modern Egyptologists, the Forgotten Pharaoh. What is known of Shepsesker primarily comes from later king lists, scattered artifacts, and archaeological anomalies. Fragments of a small pyramid in Abusir have been tentatively attributed to him, though some scholars question even this attribution. The structure appears unfinished, suggesting either an abrupt end to his reign or an abandonment of the project entirely. Reliefs and inscriptions that might have celebrated his achievements are missing, leaving only speculation about his intentions as a ruler. Archaeologists are left to piece together a reign that is more puzzle than narrative, highlighting the gaps and uncertainties of early dynastic records. Shepsesker's rise and sudden disappearance raise important questions about succession and legitimacy in Egypt. A pharaoh's authority depended not only on divine sanction, but also on acceptance by the bureaucracy, priests, and military. If Shepsesker was indeed a rival claimant, his inability to consolidate power may explain why his reign left so few traces. Even a king of royal blood could vanish from memory if he failed to secure support from the crucial institutions that sustained Egyptian governance. The fragility of his position underscores how quickly fortunes could change in the ancient world. The lack of trade or military records from Shepseskir's reign suggests that he did not have time to launch significant expeditions or enforce administrative initiatives, unlike Sahir or Neferkare, who strengthened naval power and trade networks. Shepseskir's ephemeral rule left Egypt's economy and foreign relations largely untouched. This absence of action may have contributed to his historical obscurity. Kings are remembered for deeds, and deeds take time to accomplish. Shepseskir, for reasons unknown, never had that opportunity. Some scholars hypothesize that Shepseskir may have died unexpectedly, perhaps from illness or an accident before completing his projects. Others suggest that he was overthrown or sidelined by other members of the royal family. The truth remains hidden in the sands of time, leaving historians to rely on indirect evidence, the size and location of his pyramid fragments, comparisons to other 5th dynasty rulers, and the gaps in official king lists. Every detail or lack thereof paints a picture of impermanence, of a ruler whose reign was too brief to leave a lasting impression. Yet, despite the obscurity, Shepseskir's story is valuable. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by long-reigning kings and monumental achievements, but also by those whose existence is fleeting and mysterious. The disappearance of Shepseskir from the historical record highlights how fragile power can be, how easily rulers can vanish, and how much of history is constructed from surviving evidence and therefore subject to gaps, uncertainties, and speculation. Even the unfinished pyramid attributed to him offers insight. Its mere existence suggests that Shepseskir intended to follow the dynastic tradition of pyramid building, integrating mortuary temples, causeways, and ritual spaces. The structure, though incomplete, indicates that he was aware of the symbolic importance of these monuments, even if he never realized his vision. In this sense, Shepseskir's story is a cautionary tale about the tension between intention and reality, ambition and circumstance. As Egyptologists continue to study Abusir and examine fragments from the 5th dynasty, Shepseskir remains a phantom figure, a ruler defined as much by absence as by presence. He prompts reflection on the nature of historical memory, how some rulers are immortalized in stone and story, while others fade almost entirely, leaving only questions. What circumstances led to his brief reign? Was he a victim of intrigue, illness, or misfortune? How would Egypt have evolved had he governed for years instead of months? These questions linger, unresolved, inviting both curiosity and contemplation. Shepseskir's reign, ephemeral though it was, also demonstrates the resilience of Egypt's institutions. Even without strong leadership, the kingdom endured. The administration, temples, and bureaucracy functioned without disruption, ensuring that the succession passed smoothly to his successor, Nyasarini. In this way, Shepseskir's story is not only one of mystery and disappearance, but also a testament to the systems that allowed Egypt to thrive even amid uncertainty. Ultimately, Shepseskir teaches a lesson about history itself. Memory favors the visible, the enduring, and the monumental. Kings who vanish almost without trace remind us that much of the past is lost, that every surviving record is precious, and that what is remembered is often shaped by circumstance as much as achievement. In considering Shepseskir, we confront the ephemeral nature of power, the fragility of life, and the gaps that define our understanding of the ancient world. And so, Shepseskir remains an enigma, a ruler who existed, ruled briefly, and disappeared, leaving behind only tantalizing hints of a reign that might have been. His story invites us to ponder not only what happened during his life, but also what history chooses to remember and what it chooses to forget. Shepseskir likely ascended the throne under extraordinary circumstances. Some Egyptologists suggest he may have been a usurper or a rival claimant, challenging the standard line of succession. In the 5th dynasty, if so, his position would have been precarious from the start. Legitimacy was crucial in ancient Egypt. A pharaoh needed not only divine sanction, but also the support of priests, officials, and military leaders. Without this foundation, Even a royal birthright could not secure authority. The brevity of Shepseskir's reign implies that he struggled or failed to consolidate power in this delicate political environment. The administrative impact of Shepseskir's rule, while largely unrecorded, can be inferred from what followed. Despite his short tenure, Egypt's bureaucracy continued functioning smoothly. Temples, trade networks, and local governance operated without interruption, suggesting that the systems established by Neferkare and maintained under Neferufer were resilient enough to withstand even a transient ruler. Shepseskir, whether through design or circumstance, relied on these established structures, allowing Egypt to endure political uncertainty without collapse. Construction during his reign appears minimal, yet traces exist. Archaeologists have tentatively attributed small pyramid fragments and associated mortuary temple remnants at Abusir to Shepseskir. These structures, though incomplete, reflect adherence to 5th Dynasty architectural conventions, indicating that he intended to follow traditional practices in both funerary architecture and religious observance. The unfinished state of these monuments reinforces the fleeting nature of his rule, but also demonstrates an awareness of the symbolic role that pyramids played in legitimizing kingship. Religion likely remained a central pillar, even during a brief reign. Rituals, offerings, and temple management would have continued under the supervision of priests, ensuring that spiritual obligations were met despite the king's limited time. In ancient Egypt, religion and governance were intertwined. A king who failed to maintain the spiritual order risked undermining his authority. The continuity of religious practices during Shepseskir's tenure illustrates how institutional structures could maintain stability, even when personal leadership was ephemeral. The mystery surrounding Shepseskir's disappearance has led to multiple theories. Some propose that he died unexpectedly, perhaps due to illness or accident. Others suggest that he was deposed or forced to relinquish power in favor of Nyasserini, who subsequently stabilized the dynasty. The absence of monuments, inscriptions, or official records indicates that whatever the cause, it prevented him from leaving a lasting mark. Yet the very absence of evidence is revealing. It demonstrates the fragility of historical memory and how quickly a ruler could fade from record if circumstances were unfavorable. Shepseskir's brief tenure also offers insight into the political dynamics of early dynastic Egypt. Short reigns could destabilize succession, yet the 5th Dynasty maintained continuity through effective administration and strong institutional frameworks, even as a phantom ruler. Shepseskir's reign underscores the importance of these mechanisms in preserving state stability. The fact that Egypt endured without disruption illustrates the resilience of its political, religious, and economic systems, which could absorb the uncertainty posed by ephemeral kingship. Trade and foreign relations likely continued uninterrupted. Egypt's well-established networks with Byblos, Punt, and Nubia provided critical materials such as cedar, gold, and exotic goods. The absence of new expeditions or recorded achievements under Shepseskir suggests he did not have time to make an impact. But the ongoing flow of resources highlights the strength of systems built by previous rulers. Even a pharaoh who ruled only briefly could rely on these infrastructures to sustain the kingdom. The very mystery of Shepseskir's reign has shaped how modern historians interpret the 5th Dynasty. His ephemeral rule serves as a counterpoint to long-reigning kings who dominate popular memory. It challenges us to consider how power, legitimacy, and historical record intersect. Why are some rulers remembered while others vanish almost entirely? How much of history is determined by longevity, documentation, and monumental achievement, rather than governance or influence? Shepseskir's story offers no answers, only the tantalizing gaps that invite inquiry. Ultimately, Shepseskir's significance lies not in achievements but in absence. He demonstrates the fragile nature of kingship, the importance of institutional continuity, and the capriciousness of historical memory. His reign, though short, reminds us that history is composed as much of gaps as of records. and that even rulers who vanish can illuminate the resilience of the civilizations they briefly led. As we consider Shepsesker, we are left with questions. Was he a usurper, a legitimate heir, or merely a transitional figure whose reign was always intended to be brief? Did his disappearance reflect political intrigue, personal misfortune, or something else entirely? These uncertainties create a story defined by speculation and curiosity, highlighting the tantalizing mystery of a king who briefly held power and then disappeared from history, leaving behind a kingdom that endured despite his fleeting presence. Shepsesker's reign remains one of the most mysterious in Egyptian history. Unlike the towering monuments of Khufu or the detailed records of Neferkare and Neferufer, Shepsesker left almost nothing behind. Yet, the very absence of evidence makes his story compelling. It reminds us that history is not merely written by those who dominate, but also shaped by those who vanish, leaving only questions and tantalizing fragments for later generations to ponder. The unfinished pyramid fragments at Abusir are perhaps the most tangible evidence of Shepsesker's existence. Though incomplete, they suggest that the young pharaoh intended to adhere to the dynastic tradition of pyramid building. Mortuary temples, causeways, and subsidiary structures would have supported rituals for both the living and the dead. Even in his brief tenure, Shepsesker demonstrated an understanding of the symbolic importance of architecture in legitimizing kingship. The unfinished nature of these projects, however, speaks to the brevity of his reign and the fragility of human plans in the face of mortality or political upheaval. Religious observance during Shepsesker's rule likely continued uninterrupted, overseen by priests who managed temple rituals, offerings, and estate administration. Religion in ancient Egypt was inseparable from governance. A pharaoh's authority was reinforced through ritual and the favor of the gods. Even without a long reign, the maintenance of religious continuity was essential. The institutional strength of temples and bureaucracy allowed Egypt to endure a fleeting ruler without disruption, illustrating the resilience of the state despite the transience of individual power. Political instability may have contributed to Shepsesker's ephemeral rule. If he was indeed a rival claimant, his authority may have been contested by members of the royal family or influential officials. Egypt's monarchy relied on both divine sanction and practical legitimacy support from priests, administrators, and the military. A ruler without this backing, no matter how legitimate by birth, faced immense challenges. Shepsesker's disappearance from records hints at a reign curtailed by these pressures. Yet the kingdom endured because the administrative and religious frameworks were strong enough to absorb uncertainty, trade, and economic activity. Crucial to the stability of the kingdom would have continued largely unaffected. Egypt's existing networks with Byblos, Punt, and Nubia ensured a steady flow of resources such as cedar, gold, livestock, and exotic goods. Even without a long or celebrated reign, Shepsesker's administration benefited from these well-established systems. The resilience of trade and bureaucratic mechanisms demonstrates that the kingdom's strength was not solely dependent on the duration of a ruler's life, but on the institutions that had been carefully built over generations. The story of Shepsesker also highlights a larger historical lesson: the unpredictability of legacy. In an era when records were painstakingly inscribed and monuments carefully planned, it was still possible for a ruler to vanish from memory. Unlike kings who reigned for decades and left tangible proof of their authority, Shepsesker's influence is indirect. His reign prompts reflection on how history records or fails to record the fleeting presence of those in power, and how much of the past is reconstructed from the traces left by others. Despite the uncertainties, Shepsesker's brief tenure may have played a subtle but important role in Egypt's dynastic continuity. By occupying the throne, however briefly, he allowed for a transition that eventually placed Nicator in power. This succession stabilized the Fifth Dynasty and ensured the continuation of administrative, religious, and construction activities. In this sense, even a ruler who disappears almost entirely from the historical record can influence the trajectory of a civilization by preserving the conditions for those who follow. In examining Shepsesker, we confront the nature of historical memory itself. Kings who vanish challenge our assumptions about power and achievement. We tend to remember those who leave monuments, victories, or extensive documentation. Yet history is equally shaped by those whose lives and actions are fleeting. Shepsesker embodies this paradox, a ruler who existed, reigned, and vanished, leaving a kingdom that endured despite his obscurity. His story underscores that continuity, stability, and institutional strength often matter more than fame or longevity. Ultimately, Shepsesker teaches us that the essence of leadership is not always visible. His reign, though brief and poorly documented, is a testament to the resilience of Egypt's systems, its temples, bureaucracy, and trade networks that function independently of individual rulers. His disappearance is a reminder that history favors the visible and durable, yet the unseen mechanisms often sustain civilizations far longer than the fleeting presence of any one person. Reflecting on Shepsesker, we are left with questions that may never be fully answered. Was he a usurper or a legitimate heir? Did his reign end due to illness, political intrigue, or accident? What plans did he have that were left incomplete? These unanswered questions are precisely what make his story compelling. The mystery of Shepsesker reminds us that history is not a seamless narrative of continuous achievement, but a mosaic of known facts, speculation, and enduring gaps. In the end, the forgotten pharaoh vanishes as quietly as he arrived, leaving behind only fragments for archaeologists, historians, and curious minds to piece together. Yet in this absence lies a profound lesson. The resilience of a civilization does not rest solely on celebrated rulers or monumental achievements. It thrives through institutions, traditions, and systems capable of sustaining the kingdom through uncertainty, ambiguity, and the ephemeral nature of life. Shepsesker's story, invisible though it may be, illuminates the enduring structures that allowed Egypt to survive and flourish across centuries.